of us take for granted what a privilege it is to be able to buy freshly caught fish in almost any supermarket around the state. I know I take this for granted, and I think you do too. If you enjoy to observe our fish species in our oceans and lakes, and you enjoy to eat fish, you should become an advocate for overfishing. Today I'm going to persuade you to become an advocate for overfishing by first explaining to you the privileges that make this possible and what we must do to preserve this privilege for later generations. First, I will warn you about what global rules and regulations do not properly sustain the lives of many species of fish. Then I'm going to persuade you to believe that overfishing essentially wipes out entire populations of fish just because they're either easy to catch or good eating. And then I will tell you how, as young people, we can still reverse the damage that has been done because of this problem, and that we are the only ones capable of solving this issue. Rules and regulations were made by past and present generations to preserve the lives of fish, but they sometimes don't properly represent them. An example of this is in Russia, where the government failed to realize this, and because of this, a fish species went extinct. In an article titled "The Present State of an Arctic Char Population in Lake Imandra Subject to Overfishing," which was published in 2013, the author A.A. Lukin wrote, "The impact of amateur and sport fishing on fish stocks was not sufficiently studied and usually ignored in the territory of the Russian Federation." So essentially the Russian government, just didn't realize that they had an abundance of char in a certain lake, and because of that, many fishermen flocked to that lake to try to capitalize on that fish species, and that essentially just wiped them out. And then another article titled "Changes in Size Composition of Catches of Toothfish as a Result of Long-Term Long-Line Fishing in the Region of South Georgia and Shag Rocks," which was published in February 2nd, 2006. The author K.V. Shust and A.N. Kozlov explained how fishermen laying lines at various depths on the shelf of the ocean were catching various ages and size of toothfish. At a shorter depth with shorter line, they were catching more immature fish. At a longer depth, they were catching bigger, older fish. Because of this, they essentially caught a lot of the immature fish and made it impossible for that fish to rejuvenate and regenerate, because the immature fish were the only ones capable of reproducing, and the bigger ones, the older ones, could not. And that just goes to show you how damaging one particular way of fishing can be, and why we need to have regulation on this. And I'm a fisherman myself, so I have firsthand experienced what it's like to see immature fish caught and kept out of a small pond or lake. It doesn't matter what size the body of water it is, it will do a vast amount of damage no matter how big or how small that lake is. Now I'm going to go over some of the fish species that are targeted by overfishing and why they're targeted. In the article that I already previously mentioned, called "Changes in Size Composition of the Catches of Toothfish as a Result of Long-Term Long-Line Fishing," K.V. Shust and A.N. Kozlov wrote, "It seems to be very probable that the process of rejuvenation and respectively of a decrease in the population density and biomass of the population is irreversible in the case of the continued long-line fishing of toothfish." So essentially, they were completely fished out and are just going to go extinct now because they were using one fishing method, and because they were using one fishing method, they were only targeting one fish species and essentially wiped them all out because that fish species was good eating and easy to catch. And then the other article that I already mentioned about the present state of an Arctic char in population in Lake Imandra subject to overfishing, the author A.A. Lukin explains that in 1954, the total harvest of all char in that lake was 15.4 tons. About 10 years later, the yearly average harvest of char was only 1.64 tons. Now that just goes to show you just how dramatic overfishing can be in terms of wiping out a population. Like, there is hardly any fish left in that lake now because many tons of fish have been excessively pumped out of that lake, leaving them with almost nothing to reproduce. And yet again, it's because this fish is good eating and it's easy to catch with these net tactics that they use and patrol around the lake. Today I've explained to you what is wrong with our fishing rules and regulations and why fish species are targeted by overfishing. Now I'm going to be explaining to you what we can do as young people in order to prevent this in the future. One way we can prevent this is by simply limiting what fish species we can keep out of a lake. In an article titled "Sensitivity of North American Sturgeons and Paddlefish Fish Mortality to fish mortality, which was published in 1997, John Borman writes, restricting fishing populations may be the only tool to managers for restoring depleted populations. So this essentially means that we can decide what species of fish we can and cannot keep, and if we do so, we can keep that fish species from obliterating itself and becoming extinct. And then in the article titled Confidentially Overfishing Efforts, Data, Threat, Science and Management Process, which was published in 2012, H. Hintz and other authors write about how people studying and practicing environmental science and studies is a way that we can help these fish species, because further understanding what the environment is like will give us the ability and the resources to understand how to not target these certain fish species. So today I explained to you why overfishing is occurring and what we need to act on in order to make better rules and regulations and not damage these fish populations so they can never be fully restored. Then I explained to you what fish species are the main targets of overfishing and why they are being targeted. And finally, I went over what exact actions we must implement in order to help these fish species survive. It is a privilege to have access to freshly caught and frozen fish, and if we don't act on this impact of overfishing, this privilege will be taken away from us. And we must do this, or the future generations will have no more fish, and we will have essentially ruined our abundant resources that were made available to us because of overfishing.